Track Marshal is a brand name that was applied to a range of crawler tractors that followed on from the Fowler range, built for Marshall, Sons and Company of Gainsborough. The brand had several owners throughout the years, eventually going out of business in the 1990s due to the decline in the use of crawler tractors as higher-powered, modern wheel tractors took over. Hello everybody, you're very welcome back to the channel. So yes, today we are talking about the famous Track Marshal. And anyone who hasn't seen my previous videos on, of course, Marshall and Leyland and the Field Marshal indeed, you're more than welcome to go back and look over them. We did look at the Marshall company in a little bit more detail, Marshall tractors and the decline of the Marshall tractors. But this video is specifically geared towards the Track Marshal end of things, and that famous tractor that was famous throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and indeed into the 80s, and the decline then later on into the 90s when the more modern four-wheel drive larger machines took over, and imports I suppose started coming from the likes of Case, of course, and John Deere and Fendt, with larger four-wheel drive machines. They were a simple machine. The transmission systems on them were a lot simpler. There was generally only it was a smaller amount of gears, one drive axle, so there was one drive axle driving the track system on it, as opposed to the four-wheel drives, which were a little bit more was a little bit more mechanics involved in them. Very good traction over wet ground, sticky ground, lower ground pressure, of course. They're still used today in wet conditions, doing superb work. At a time when smaller tractors were able to pull wider implements. After, I suppose, or during war times when men and labour were a lot less available, and the women who were taking over work on farms throughout the wartime, there was a lot of emphasis put on production, productivity, getting as much work done as possible for as the least amount of effort. And if one tractor could pull something a lot wider, faster over the type of terrain that it was aimed at, that was of course beneficial. And you just go to wonder today when you look at the state of agriculture and what governments are trying to do to farmers especially, it'd just make you wonder, where has it all gone wrong, and where has the thinking? Because of course now they want farmers to grow less and to make less money. So it's a tough time for farmers at the minute, and I completely empathise with everybody across the world, not just Ireland and the UK, that has had so much pressure put on them. I don't get into political things in this channel whatsoever, as people know, but yeah, there's a lot of head scratching going on at the minute, because what they're trying to do to agriculture, the Labour Party in Britain, and of course our own Greens and whatever here that had a little bit of grip and power, they're not making anything easier for us. Anyway, we'll park all that to the side. We're going to look through the history, of course, of the Track Marshal, and of course of the Fowler company that would have been the developers, of the Marshall end of the company, the Track end of the Marshall company. And of course, as ever, if you have any history, as I always say, if you have any history with Track Marshal in particular, if you've worked on them, driven them, worked for the Marshall company, if you own one, if you're an enthusiast, please get in touch. Please drop us a comment. And if I have missed anything, or maybe had some inaccuracies in some of my research, please don't be afraid to pick me up on it and correct me, because I'm only human. I put my hands up. I do try to check as much of my information as possible, but when you're going back 100 years or more looking for history, it can be, some things can be very conflicting. So without further ado, we're going to get into the history. So we're going to start off looking at the history of the Track Marshal crawler. So the Track Marshal crawler tractor, which was produced by John Fowler and Company of Leeds, was a tracked version of the Field Marshal tractor built by Marshalls of Gainsborough. The first ones being the VF and the VFA versions. These are super looking machines, lovely machines. The colour of them was fantastic. Fowler's, like Marshalls, being a builder of steam machinery, including ploughing engines. So looking into the background of the Fowler company itself, so Fowler of Leeds was controlled by the Supply Ministry during the war due to an industrial dispute that started in December 1940. They built no crawlers during the war, instead building tanks and generators for the ministry. In 1945, they were designing a new range, the FD line, and started production of the FD2s. They built a few FD2s and about 700 FD3s in 18 months. A new model, the FD1, was developed, and the FD4 was introduced, and 14 had been built when Fowler's was sold to T.W. Ward, the owner of Marshall's of Gainsborough, and by then the parent company, Rotary Hose. The Marshall replaced the Fowler FD line with their VF range of crawlers based on the Field Marshall tractor engine. So John Fowler and Company engineers of Leeds, West Yorkshire, England produced the D traction engines, ploughing implements and equipment, as well as railway equipment. Fowler also produced the Track Marshall tractor, of course, which was the track version of the Field Marshall. British Railway Engineering Department locomotives ED1 to ED7 were also built by the Fowler Company. So looking at the history then, John Fowler himself was an agricultural engineer and inventor who was born in Wiltshire in 1826. He worked on the mechanisation of agriculture and was based in Leeds. He is credited with the invention of the steam engine ploughing engines. He died on the 4th of December 1864 following a hunting accident. After his death, John Fowler and Company was then continued by Robert Fowler and Robert Edison. In 1886, the limited company of John Fowler and Company of Leeds was formed. It merged with Marshall and Sons Limited of Gainsborough in 1974 to form the Marshall Fowler Limited. Although not well known by then, Fowler also built a small number of steam wagons. They were vertically boiled with unusual single-crank cross-compound V-twin engine. They featured a gearbox with no clutch to provide a low drive ratio for climbing steep hills with heavy loads. At least one was preserved as part of the Tom Varley collection. Production of ploughing engines ceased in 1935. The last Fowler steam drive vehicle was a steamroller produced in 1937. The main products produced by Fowler during the 1930s was the range of track tractors, the FD2, 3 and 4, powered by Fowler standard diesel engines of 2, 3 and 4 cylinders. They also produced the Fowler Gyrotiller from 1927. This was a very large tracked vehicle, 34 foot long, 10 foot 6 inches wide, powered initially by a 225 horsepower Ricardo petrol engine, later by 170 horsepower MAN diesel. It was claimed it could convert virgin territory to seedbed in one pass at a rate of 1 acre per hour. Later versions of the Gyrotiller were produced as attachments for standard Fowler diesel crawler range, with Fowler standard engines 30, 40 and 80 horsepower. A total of 88 Gyrotillers were produced. During the Second World War, the Hunslet factory also produced Matilda, Cromwell and Centaur tanks for the army. Track castings were made at a Ministry of Supply factory built in 1943 at Sproutborough, and after the war, Fowler acquired this highly mechanised foundry. In 1947, Fowler came under the ownership of Marshall, Sons and Company, themselves owned by Thomas W. Ward Limited. The two companies produced agricultural tractors, with Fowler focusing on the track versions and Marshall focusing on the wheel versions. Although Fowler operated as a subsidiary of Marshall until at least 1966, the companies were eventually merged, and the exhibits at the 1970 Smithfield show, 3 new tracked Marshall tractors were attributed to Marshall Fowler Limited. John Fowler Works, Leeds. Production at the Hunslet factory finally ceased sometime around 1974, by which time production of both tracked and wheel tractors had been moved to Marshall Works at Gainsborough. Fowler has bought the Ministry commissioned casting factory at Sproutborough, which was built to produce tracks for the tanks in the war. Cast tracks were cheaper to produce and less machinery is required. The VF was built until 1957. Track Marshall itself, in 1956, the first Track Marshall model was introduced, followed by the Challenger 3 and then the Challenger 33. In 1970, Bristol Tractors Limited was taken over and the operation moved from Southbridge Mill, Irby, in the former West Riding of Yorkshire, now part of Lancashire, to the Marshall factory in Gainsborough. The tractor line was discontinued, but the Taurus loading shovel was rebranded as a Track Marshall 1100, retaining the 3-cylinder Perkins engine. In 1970, an operation was started to assemble CKD kits of Track Marshall machines in India by Britannia Engineering and Company Limited of West Bengal. In 1974, the Fowler Steam Ploughs Work in Leeds closed, with production transferred to Gainsborough, Lincolnshire. In 1975, T.W. Wards sold the company to British Leyland, who then marketed the crawler range under the Avling Marshall division. Leyland dropped Marshall's diesel road roller production in favour of Avling Marshall's rollers, which they had also owned. Leyland merged Marshalls with Avling to form Avling Marshall Limited. they developed some new models to compete with the rising higher horsepower tractors taken over from crawlers. So the AM100, the 110 and the 105, the latter was switched to a Ford engine. These new models had a cab standard, quality went downhill, and Leyland, in financial trouble at the time, sold the crawler tractor division in 1979 to local businessman Charles Nickerson, and we all know how that went. They improved quality and also bought the wheel tractor division in 1982, but that proved troublesome and subsequently brought the company down in 1985. The Marshall Tractors operation then been sold to Bentel Simplex and moved to Scunthorpe. In 1989, Bentel Simplex imported some Steyr tractors from Steyr Daimler Puch in Austria and branded them as Marshall. They ceased in 1991 when Steyr opened their own UK operation. The crawler division was bought from the receivers by Hubert Flatters, an ex-Marshall Fowler's man, in a management buyout to form Track Marshall of Gainsborough Limited. They introduced a new model, the TM155, in 1985, following increased demand due to the poor weather in 1983-84. Flatters died in 1987 and the company was sold in 1990 to TWR Group. TWR imported an Australian rubber tracked crawler designed by Waltana to sell as the Track Marshall 200. By the early 90s, sales had fallen off and production moved to a build-to-order basis for the TM135, and they focused on rebuilding older machines. The name has been used in several forms during the brand's life. Early machines had the hyphen form Track Marshall used on the machine sides, while the latter Track Marshall Limited machines used the unhyphen form. Marshall Publicity and other publications appeared to use both forms in the early days. The Avling Marshall era appears to use the name in both forms as well, with the hyphen name used for model designations on the machine side. The last Track Marshall crawled off the production line sometime around 1993, a TM200 series model by Marshalls of Gainsborough. The company had a long history of producing crawler tractors since the post-war era, with the TM being one of the most popular ranges. And that's it, basically. That's a very, very quick and brief summary of the Track Marshall era, the range. A lot of stuff we have covered before in the Marshall end of things. So that's it. So again, if you have anything you'd like to add, if you drive one, if you're part of a Track Marshall Society or group, if you're interested in looking at, working models, I would recommend Anglian Agri Media on YouTube, a superb channel that focuses on machines from the 60s, 70s, 80s into the 90s, that sort of era, and they have fantastic machines. Nice short videos, anyone that's interested, and there's lots up there on Track Marshall. So that's it for today. I'm going to go now, get this edited. Hopefully it's going to be out on Sunday morning. To everyone who subscribed from watching last week's video, previous videos, everyone that got in touch with me, thanks a million, and I will be back next week with another video. Thank you.